10 True Scary Night Travel Horror Stories. Story number 1. The Road That Wasn't There. Julie had driven this road countless times. It was the same winding stretch of highway that had led her home after long days of work, after weekends spent with friends, after every trip she'd ever taken. But tonight something felt off. The night was unusually quiet, the kind of stillness that made her senses sharpen, her grip on the steering wheel tightening. The familiar rhythm of the car's tires against the asphalt was comforting, but the shadows that stretched across the road felt deeper, darker than usual. She glanced at the dashboard. 2:37 a.m. She was exhausted, but the road ahead was clear, the headlights casting long beams of white light, illuminating the empty stretch of highway. She had just passed the old oak tree, the one with the twisted branches that always reminded her of a crooked hand reaching up to the sky, when she noticed it. The bend in the road ahead, the one she had taken thousands of times, was wrong. It wasn't quite right. Her foot hesitated on the gas pedal as she approached it. Turning the wheel gently, she followed the curve. But instead of the usual stretch of road, there was nothing. No familiar turn, no guardrail, no signpost. Just a sudden drop into a dense forest that hadn't been there a moment before. Julie slammed her foot on the brake, the car screeching as it skidded across the road. Her heart pounded in her chest as she tried to process what had just happened. The road ahead had completely vanished. It was replaced by a thick, unwelcoming fog that swallowed the landscape, and in its depths she could make out the outline of trees, massive, twisted trees, their trunks black and contorted as if they were reaching toward her. Her breath quickened, panic creeping into her thoughts. No, this wasn't possible. This couldn't be happening. She shifted the car into reverse and slowly backed up, hoping that whatever was wrong would correct itself. But as she reached the point where the road had disappeared, she saw only more of the same. Thick trees and fog, a never-ending expanse of darkness. She turned the wheel hard to the left, thinking she might have missed a turn she'd forgotten about. But there was nothing. Just the deep woods that now seemed to encircle her. Julie's hands shook as she fumbled for her phone, her fingers slipping across the screen in the dim light. No signal. No bars. She stared at the blank screen, her mind racing. The fog was closing in, thicker now, wrapping around the car like a living thing. She could feel it pressing against the windows, an oppressive weight in the air that made her chest tighten. She tried to start the car again, but the engine sputtered, refusing to turn over. The headlights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, plunging her into total darkness. A sudden chill swept through the car, and Julie gasped, her breath visible in the freezing air. Her eyes darted to the rearview mirror, and for a fleeting second she thought she saw something. No, someone, standing just beyond the fog, at the edge of the trees. A figure, tall, dark, and still. But when she blinked, it was gone. Just like that. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she wiped her hand across her forehead. She was losing her mind. It had to be the exhaustion, the late hours catching up with her. It wasn't real, none of it was real. But then she heard it. A sound, faint at first, but growing louder. A rustling in the fog, like footsteps, slow and deliberate. Her body stiffened. The hair on the back of her neck rose. "Hello," Julie called out, her voice weak, trembling. She didn't know what she was expecting. There was no answer, only the oppressive silence and the rustling growing closer. Her mind screamed at her to leave, to drive, to run, to do anything but sit there and wait for whatever was out there to find her. But her hands wouldn't move. She was frozen in place, trapped in the fog, surrounded by trees that seemed to close in around her like the jaws of some unseen beast. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the edge of the fog, just beyond the reach of her headlights. It was tall, dressed in ragged clothing that fluttered in the wind. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at her with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through the mist. Julie's heart stopped. It wasn't a person. It was something else. Something wrong. Something that had no place in this world. Her breath caught in her throat as the figure slowly raised its hand. Not to wave, but to point, toward the center of the fog, toward a shape that seemed to be growing larger, taking form. The trees around her began to sway, not in the wind, but as if something was shifting beneath the earth itself. Julie's pulse quickened, and in that moment she realized something she hadn't fully grasped before. The road was gone, and she wasn't going anywhere. A low, guttural whisper began to fill the car, just beneath her hearing. It wasn't words, not exactly. It was a sound, a hum, like an invitation or a warning. She couldn't tell which. Julie grabbed the door handle and yanked, but it wouldn't open. The figure in the fog moved closer, its presence growing heavier, pressing against her chest like a weight she couldn't escape. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stopped, its hand lowering slowly. It stepped back into the fog, disappearing into the mist like a phantom. Julie blinked, her heart racing. For a moment, the fog seemed to part just enough for her to see something beyond it. A flicker of light in the distance. The road, the real road. But before she could reach for the gear shift, the mist closed in again, thicker than ever. In a panic, Julie put the car in reverse once more, slamming the gas pedal to the floor. The fog surged, the trees shifting in ways that shouldn't be possible. But no matter how fast she drove, the road refused to appear. And soon, she realized with sinking dread that there was no road, not anymore. She was trapped in a place that had never existed. She wasn't on a road at all, she was somewhere else. Somewhere far worse than she could have ever imagined. Story number 2. Midnight Passenger. It was just after midnight when Ethan boarded the last train out of the city. The station was eerily quiet, and the only sound was the distant hum of the train's engine as it pulled into the platform. Ethan had taken this route countless times before, but tonight, the chill in the air seemed to settle deeper into his bones. He pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders and stepped aboard the nearly empty train. The interior was dim, the overhead lights flickering every few seconds. A single attendant walked down the aisle, offering half-hearted greetings as he passed. Ethan chose a seat by the window, leaning his forehead against the cool glass. He tried to relax, but something about the silence felt wrong, too heavy. The train pulled away from the station, the sound of the wheels clattering over the tracks filling the cabin. Ethan stared out into the dark countryside, the occasional flicker of a distant streetlight casting brief shadows across the fields. As the train rattled onward, his tired eyes began to wander around the cabin, taking in the few passengers scattered throughout. There was a man in the seat across from him, a woman sitting near the back, and a young couple by the window. Nothing unusual at first glance, except for one thing. None of them blinked. Ethan blinked, rubbed his eyes, and glanced around again. The man across from him was staring straight ahead, his eyes wide open, unblinking. The same was true for the woman, her gaze fixed on nothing in particular. Even the couple, who were sitting close together, their heads turned slightly toward one another, were staring with unnerving intensity. His heart skipped a beat, a strange unease creeping up his spine. He looked at his own reflection in the window, trying to reassure himself. Maybe it was just fatigue. Maybe he hadn't been getting enough sleep. But no, the others still weren't blinking, not once. The train rattled on, the miles passing by unnoticed. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, trying to shake off the odd feeling gnawing at him. He had seen strange things in his life, but this was something new, something wrong. The whispers started quietly, a soft murmur that he couldn't place. At first, he thought it was just the sound of the train itself, the wind slipping through cracks in the walls. But then the whispers became clearer, and they were coming from somewhere inside the cabin, swirling around him, rising in volume. Ethan's heart pounded. The voices sounded like a conversation, too distant to make out the words but unmistakable in their tone. He leaned forward, searching the faces of the passengers. None of them reacted. They were still staring, their eyes unblinking, locked in a trance-like state. The whispers were getting louder now, almost deafening. His eyes darted around the cabin, desperate to find the source, but there was no one who looked like they were speaking. "Excuse me," Ethan said, his voice shaky as he stood up and approached the conductor. "Can you hear that? The whispers? What's going on?" The conductor, a thin man with graying hair and a tired expression, didn't even glance up. "The train is running fine, sir. No problems here." "But," Ethan began, his voice faltering, "I hear whispers and none of these people are blinking. Don't you notice anything strange?" The conductor blinked slowly, then shook his head, his expression blank. "I think you're just tired. Everything's fine. Take a seat and relax." Ethan stared at him, his confusion deepening. He couldn't be imagining it. The whispers were getting louder, so close now that he could almost feel them against his skin, curling around him like invisible fingers. The man sitting across from him, he had to do something. Ethan walked up to him, standing over his seat. The man was still staring straight ahead, not a single blink. His eyes were dry, vacant, like glass. "Excuse me," Ethan said urgently. "Are you okay? Can you hear me?" The man didn't respond. Ethan waved a hand in front of his face. Still nothing. The whispers swirled around his head, growing more insistent now, more frantic, like they were trying to warn him about something. A sudden lurch of the train broke his focus, and Ethan stumbled back to his seat. The light flickered once more, and when it settled, the landscape outside had changed. Instead of the rolling fields of the countryside, all Ethan could see now was the blurred outline of an old, abandoned station in the distance, the platform overrun with weeds and rusted rails. Ethan's blood ran cold. He had never seen this station before. It wasn't on the route, wasn't on any map. He had ridden this train countless times, and yet, this place, this station, was not supposed to exist. The whispers, now louder than ever, filled the air. They were no longer vague, distorted sounds, but clear voices, repeating the same words over and over. "Get off! It's too late! Get off!" The train was slowing down. The distant station grew larger, closer. Ethan stood up, his legs trembling, and made his way toward the door. He needed to leave. Now, something wasn't right. He grabbed the handle, yanked it hard, but the door wouldn't open. Panicked, he tried again, pulling with all his strength, but the door remained shut. His breath came faster, his chest tight as he backed away, eyes darting between the passengers. None of them moved, none of them blinked. They were all staring at him now, their gaze intense, unblinking, like they were waiting for something. The train came to a screeching halt just as the station loomed outside the window. Ethan's eyes widened. The platform was empty, lifeless, but something told him that the moment he stepped off, he wouldn't be the same. The whispers rose to a crescendo. "Get off now." His hand hovered over the door handle one last time, but before he could pull it open, a sharp, metallic sound echoed through the train. A voice, cold and distant, spoke from the dark recesses of the car. "You're already here." Ethan froze, his heart hammering in his chest. He turned slowly, his breath catching in his throat. The figure of the conductor stood at the end of the car, his face pale, his eyes empty. And for the first time, the conductor blinked, slowly, inhumanly slow. The train jerked forward again, and with a sickening realization, Ethan understood. The station wasn't waiting for him. It had been waiting for the train. And now, he was part of the ride. The whispers grew louder, and in that moment he realized there was no escape, no way to turn back. The train had already begun its next journey. Story number 3. The Hitchhiker Who Knew Too Much. Laura and Mark had been driving for hours. The sun had long since set, and the darkness of the open road stretched out in front of them like a black void. They were on a road trip to the coast, their car humming steadily over the asphalt, the occasional mile marker flicking by like a forgotten thought. The radio played softly in the background, but the songs had long since turned into background noise, the kind of sound that filled the space between their tired conversations. "Do you think we'll make it by midnight?" Laura asked, glancing at her phone, which was struggling to get a signal. "Shouldn't be a problem," Mark replied, his eyes still fixed on the road. "We're ahead of schedule." They had been driving through the middle of nowhere for what felt like hours. The trees along the side of the road were bare, the land around them flat and unremarkable. There was no sign of life, no other cars, no houses, nothing but the occasional stretch of dark highway. As they approached a curve in the road, Mark noticed something out of the corner of his eye. A figure, standing at the edge of the highway, a silhouette in the dim headlights. "Looks like someone's hitchhiking," Mark said, slowing the car down. Laura glanced at him, then out the window. The figure stood motionless, their thumb extended in the classic hitchhiker gesture. A man, dressed in a dark coat, his face partially obscured by the shadows. "We should pick him up," Laura said, though she felt a tiny knot of unease in her stomach. Mark hesitated. It was late, and they were in the middle of nowhere. They'd been warned about picking up strangers, but there was something about the man, his stillness, the quiet desperation in the way he stood, that made Mark feel like they had no other choice. "All right," Mark muttered, pulling over. "We'll make it quick." The hitchhiker didn't say anything when he got in. He simply opened the door, slid into the back seat, and buckled his seatbelt. The couple exchanged a glance, both unsettled but unsure why. It wasn't like the man had done anything wrong, yet. "Where are you headed?" Mark asked, trying to make conversation as the car resumed its slow journey down the dark highway. The hitchhiker didn't answer right away. His eyes seemed to look through the windshield, beyond the road ahead, as though seeing something far off in the distance. After a long pause, he spoke. "You're headed to the coast, right?" he said, his voice low, almost too calm for the situation. "You'll get there, but it won't be the way you think." Laura shivered, unsure whether she should respond. "Yeah, that's the plan," she said, trying to sound casual. The hitchhiker smiled, but there was something about it, something off. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "You'll get there, but you'll wish you hadn't." The air in the car suddenly felt thick, as if the very atmosphere had changed. Mark shot a quick glance at Laura, who was now staring out the window, her mind clearly working through something she couldn't explain. "You okay?" Mark asked her, his voice a little too loud in the sudden silence. "Yeah," she replied, her voice distant. "Just tired, I guess." The rest of the drive passed in uneasy quiet. The man in the back seat said little, his eyes never leaving the road ahead. But as the miles passed, strange things began to happen. The car's headlights flickered once, then twice, casting eerie shadows across the road. Mark checked the dashboard. Nothing seemed off, but the feeling of something being wrong started to settle in his chest. "Did you see that?" Laura asked suddenly. Mark turned to look at her, confused. "What? See what?" "That sign," she said, her voice tight with unease. "Back there, the one that said next town, 50 miles, it just disappeared." Mark frowned. "You're probably just seeing things. You're exhausted, Laura. We're both exhausted." But even as he said it, something in him didn't feel right. He glanced in the rearview mirror. The hitchhiker was staring at him now, his eyes glinting with an almost knowing quality, like he was aware of every thought running through Mark's head. "Something's going to happen tonight," the hitchhiker said suddenly, his voice sharp in the stillness of the car. "You won't be able to stop it." The words sent a chill down Mark's spine. Laura's hand, which had been resting in her lap, tightened into a fist. The air inside the car grew colder, and the sound of the tires against the road seemed muffled, as if the world outside had grown quieter. Mark looked ahead, trying to ignore the feeling of dread creeping over him. He focused on the road, on the headlights cutting through the darkness, but the road ahead started to shift, to twist in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The straight line of asphalt seemed to warp, and the shadows that lined the road seemed to move, like they were watching them. "Where are we?" Laura asked, her voice trembling now. "This doesn't feel like the same road." Mark's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about? But when he looked out the windshield, he saw what she meant. The road had changed. The familiar stretch of a highway had been replaced by a narrow, winding path. On either side, dark trees leaned in, their branches tangled like skeletal fingers, as if they were closing in on them. The hitchhiker was no longer just sitting quietly in the back seat. He was now staring at them both, his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "You've passed the point of no return," the hitchhiker said softly. "There's no turning back now." Mark's breath caught in his throat. The road ahead had disappeared. The world around them felt as though it was folding in on itself. Time unraveling, like they were slipping through the cracks of reality itself. "Who are you?" Laura demanded, her voice shaky but insistent. "What do you want from us?" The hitchhiker didn't answer. Instead, he just smiled again, that same empty smile, and as he did, the air grew thick with the scent of something foul, rotting, decaying. And in the silence that followed, Mark realized something that made his stomach turn. The man wasn't a traveler. He wasn't just hitchhiking. He was leading them toward something, toward an inevitable end. Story number 4. The Whispering Highway. Hank had been driving for hours. The road stretched out before him, endless and empty. The only company the low hum of the truck's engine and the occasional flicker of the headlights cutting through the dark. He was used to the night drives, used to the solitude of the long, lonely stretches of highway. The truck was his life, and the highway was his second home. But tonight felt different. The locals had warned him about this stretch of road, the one they called the Whispering Highway. Hank had heard the stories about the strange noises that seemed to echo from the surrounding hills at night. Whispers carried by the wind. Voices that could never be fully understood. He'd always chalked it up to superstition, just stories meant to keep the outsiders on edge. He'd driven this road dozens of times before without any trouble, and he didn't expect tonight to be any different. But as the truck rumbled down the highway, something changed. The air felt heavier, thicker, as though the night itself was pressing against the cab. The usual sounds of the engine and the tires against the asphalt seemed muffled, replaced by a faint, distant noise. A whisper. At first, Hank thought it was just the wind, or maybe the hum of the truck playing tricks on him. But the whisper grew louder. It sounded almost like voices, too soft to understand but too clear to ignore. His heart rate quickened as he tried to shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then he heard it again, louder this time. His name. Hank. It was so soft, so faint, that he almost couldn't believe it. His grip tightened on the wheel, and he glanced nervously at the road ahead. The whispers were coming from the hills that lined the highway, swirling around him, rising from the darkness like an unseen presence. He shook his head. "It's nothing," he muttered to himself, trying to push the feeling of unease down. He was just tired. Long hours on the road always messed with his head. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew more insistent. "Hank, Hank." His eyes darted to the rearview mirror, then to the side windows. There was nothing out there, just the dark, endless road. But the whispering grew louder, and now it was more than just his name. There were words now, though still unclear. He could hear the panic in the voices, like they were trying to warn him. He slammed his foot on the brake and pulled over to the side of the road, the truck's tires screeching as it came to a halt. The engine sputtered and died in the quiet. Hank sat frozen for a moment, staring into the darkness. The whispers had stopped. The only sound now was the beating of his own heart in his ears. He opened the door and stepped out, his boots hitting the gravel with a dull thud. The cool night air hit him like a wave, and he immediately regretted stopping. There was something wrong about the silence out here. It felt unnatural, as though the world had paused just for him. He glanced around, squinting into the night, but all he could see was the endless stretch of highway and the distant hills, dark and still. The air was thick, as though it was holding its breath. He listened for a moment longer, but the whispers were gone. "Just tired," he muttered to himself again, shaking his head. "Just need some rest." He climbed back into the truck and slammed the door shut, locking it behind him. The engine roared to life again, but as soon as he put the truck in gear, the whispers returned. This time, they were clearer, sharper. "Hank." The voice was unmistakable. It was right behind him. Hank's pulse raced. He swung his head around, but there was no one there. No figures, no shadows. Just the dark highway stretching ahead. Yet the feeling of being watched was overwhelming, as though something was there, just out of sight. And then, in the corner of his eye, he saw them. Figures. Pale, human shapes. Just barely visible at the edge of the road, standing still, watching him. They were distant at first, barely more than shapes in the mist. But as Hank's eyes widened, they grew closer. One, then two, then more. They were all moving toward him, their bodies gliding across the ground, their faces obscured in shadow. His hands trembled as he gripped the wheel. "This isn't real! This isn't real!" He pressed his foot harder on the gas, but the truck barely moved. The figures were closing in, their footsteps silent on the pavement, their presence almost suffocating. The whispers had become louder, a cacophony of voices filling his head, all calling his name. "Hank, Hank, you can't escape." The words were no longer whispers, they were commands. He slammed the truck into reverse, throwing it into gear with a jolt. The figures had surrounded him now, their faces hidden, their bodies moving closer, blocking his path. His truck surged backward, but the road behind him was as twisted and unfamiliar as the one ahead. No matter which direction he went, the figures followed, closing in, never leaving. Panic set in. The whispers were no longer just sounds, they were thoughts, invading his mind, pushing him toward a terrible realization. This road, this highway, was a trap. A place where time and space didn't work the way they should. A place that twisted reality itself. And the figures, he realized with growing horror, were waiting for him. Waiting to pull him into the darkness. With every turn he made, the road seemed to stretch on forever, endless and unchanging. The mist thickened around him, swallowing the truck. filling the air with a sense of doom. He could hear the voices now, not just in his ears, but in his head, echoing with an urgency he couldn't escape. He wasn't just lost on this highway, he was trapped. As the figures pressed closer, their pale, featureless faces slowly becoming visible in the fog, Hank understood that there was no way out, no escape. They weren't just watching him, they were guiding him toward something he couldn't outrun. The truck's engine sputtered and died again, the lights flickering once more. The whispering voices filled the air, and in that moment Hank knew the truth. The whispering highway wasn't just a road, it was a place between worlds. A place where travelers went to disappear. And now, it was his turn. The last thing Hank heard before the darkness swallowed him whole was his own name. Hank. Story number 5. The Vanishing Town. Greg had been driving for hours, the headlights of his car cutting through the darkness of the empty highway. The road stretched on endlessly, and the only sound was the steady hum of the engine. It had been a long day of driving cross-country, and he was starting to feel the exhaustion in his bones. He needed to find a place to rest soon, but he hadn't seen a gas station or motel in miles. As he passed a small sign for a town called Ashford, he glanced at the clock. It was already well past midnight. He had been following the same stretch of highway for hours, but somehow he had missed the last exit. Thinking he could at least grab a quick bite and stretch his legs, Greg decided to take the turn into the town. The road was narrow and winding, the trees on either side thick and dense, blocking out most of the moonlight. As he drove further in, the fog began to roll in, creeping over the road and swallowing up the headlights. It was the kind of fog that made everything feel suffocating, like you were trapped in a world that didn't quite make sense. Greg slowed the car, squinting ahead. The town appeared suddenly, almost as if it had materialized out of the mist. He could make out the outlines of old, decaying buildings, their windows dark and empty. The streets were eerily quiet. No cars, no sounds of life. A chill ran down his spine, but he figured it was just the odd, isolated feeling that came with late-night driving. He drove down the main street, his headlights reflecting off the cracked pavement. He wasn't sure what had drawn him in, but there was something about the place that didn't feel right. It wasn't just the silence, it was the stillness, the sense that nothing moved here, that time had stopped. The town seemed to be stuck in some forgotten era. The architecture looked old, but not in the charming way of a historic town. It was deteriorating, falling apart. Storefronts with broken windows and peeling paint. Streetlights that flickered like they hadn't been repaired in decades. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't moved in years. Greg decided to find a place to rest for the night. He pulled into what looked like a small diner, its neon sign buzzing weakly. He got out of the car and walked up to the door, feeling the weight of the silence press down on him. The door opened with a creak, and he stepped inside. The diner was dimly lit, and the few people inside turned to look at him as he entered. They were all sitting at tables, their faces expressionless but polite. An older man behind the counter smiled at him as he walked in. His teeth were too white, too perfect, and his eyes seemed unnaturally bright. "Can I help you, son?" the man asked, his voice too friendly, almost too eager. Greg hesitated for a moment. "I was just looking for a place to stop. I'm on a long drive and thought I'd grab something to eat." "Of course," the man said, still smiling. "Take a seat anywhere. We don't get many travelers around here, but you're always welcome." Greg felt an odd unease stir in him, but he shrugged it off. He sat at a booth in the corner, and a waitress came over almost immediately. She was young, with wide eyes and a smile that seemed a little too perfect, too rehearsed. "What can I get you, hun?" she asked, her voice sweet and overly bright. Just a coffee, I guess, Greg said, trying to ignore the growing sense of discomfort. And maybe some pie. The waitress nodded eagerly and turned to go, but not before giving him a look that seemed a little too curious, as though she were studying him in a way that didn't feel quite right. As Greg sat there, sipping his coffee, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The people in the diner were too calm, too polite. There was no sense of urgency or noise, no laughter or conversation. It was as if everyone was stuck in a moment, frozen in time. He stood up to pay, and the man behind the counter handed him the check with the same unsettling smile. "Enjoy your stay in Ashford," he said, as if they expected him to stay longer than he had intended. Greg left the diner and returned to his car, his mind racing. There was no gas station here, no place to stay the night. It was as if the town had appeared out of nowhere, and now it felt like it was trying to keep him there. The air had grown colder, and the fog had thickened, wrapping around the buildings and streets like a shroud. He started the car and turned back onto the main road, hoping to find his way out. But as he drove, the road began to twist and bend in ways that didn't make sense. He turned a corner and found himself back on the same street, the same broken storefronts, the same eerie silence. Greg tried again, turning onto another street, but it was the same. No matter which way he turned, he ended up back in the same place. He began to panic, his heart racing as he floored the gas pedal, trying to break free from the town. But it was no use. Ashford wouldn't let him leave. The town was alive in a way that felt wrong, like it wasn't just a place but a living thing, trapping him in its cycle. The people too seemed to be a part of it, frozen in time, caught in the same loop, unable to escape. He drove down one final street, the fog so thick now that he could barely see, and there, at the end of the road, he saw them. The townspeople. They were standing in the middle of the road, blocking his way. Their faces were no longer friendly. Their smiles had faded, replaced with empty, soulless expressions. Greg slammed on the brakes, but the car didn't stop. It kept moving, slowly, almost as if the car itself was being drawn toward them. As the fog closed in around him, he realized the truth. Ashford wasn't just a town. It was a prison, a place trapped in a time loop. And now he was a part of it, stuck in a never-ending cycle, just like the others. The townsfolk reached the car and opened the door. Their hands were cold as they dragged him out, pulling him toward the center of town. The fog swirled around them, and in that moment, Greg understood that he was the next one. The next name to be added to the long list of souls trapped in Ashford, doomed to live out eternity in a town that never existed, never left, and never allowed anyone to escape. The last thing he heard before the fog swallowed him was the sound of the town's clock, striking midnight again. Story number 6. The empty car. Darren's car sputtered to a stop in the middle of nowhere. He had been driving for hours, the lonely highway stretching endlessly in front of him. The tires hummed on the asphalt, a sound he had become used to during these long, late-night drives. But now, the engine gave a final groan, and the car died. Darren cursed under his breath, slamming his palms against the steering wheel. His phone had no signal. The darkness around him was so complete that it felt like he was the only living thing in the world. There were no other cars, no lights, just the silent stretch of road and the occasional whisper of the wind through the trees. He stepped out of the car and popped the hood, hoping it was something simple. A busted wire, a dead battery, anything that could get him moving again. But the engine was cold and the air felt unnaturally still. No signs of life, no sound of critters moving in the brush. It was as if the entire world had gone silent, holding its breath. After 10 minutes of fruitless attempts to get the engine running again, Darren cursed again, frustration bubbling up. He checked the time, nearly 2 a.m. He was at least an hour from the nearest town, and who knew how long it would take for anyone to pass by on this deserted stretch of road. That's when he saw it. Up ahead, just past a curve in the road, there was a car, parked perfectly along the shoulder. The engine was running, the headlights casting an eerie glow over the empty highway. There was no one inside. Darren felt a strange tug at his chest. He wasn't the kind of person to take risks, but he couldn't stay out here alone, not like this. The night felt wrong, like it was waiting for something. With no other choice, he decided to investigate. He walked toward the car, the crunch of his boots the only sound breaking the silence. As he got closer, he saw that the vehicle was an old sedan, its paint chipped and faded. The engine hummed softly, but the inside was completely empty. No driver, no passengers. The door was unlocked, and a sudden wave of unease washed over him. He hesitated for a moment, then opened the door. The interior was stuffy, warm from the running engine. A faint smell of leather and dust hung in the air. Darren sat down, grateful for any shelter from the cold night. He closed the door behind him and leaned back in the seat, trying to calm his nerves. The car was a perfect hiding place for now. He tried to relax, but the silence was thick, almost suffocating. The hum of the engine was the only noise, and yet it didn't seem comforting, more like the sound of something watching him. The longer he sat there, the more uncomfortable he felt. He checked the time again. It had been 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. His hands were clammy and his heart was racing for reasons he couldn't explain. The air inside the car seemed to grow heavier. The heat from the engine was too much now, pressing down on him. He cracked the window, but it didn't help. The air was stale, thick with an unseen weight. He glanced around, suddenly aware of the small space around him, how the car seemed to be closing in on him with each passing minute. Then the rattling began. It started softly, a faint noise that he might have dismissed as nothing more than the car settling or the wind shifting. But it grew louder, more deliberate. The door handle rattled. The windows trembled. The seats creaked under the weight of an invisible presence. Darren's pulse quickened, his breath shallow. He turned his head to look at the dashboard, the speedometer, the glove box, anything to give him an explanation for what was happening. But there was nothing. No logical reason. The car wasn't supposed to do this. Then, as if on cue, the lights flickered. At first, it was just a brief flicker, but it became more erratic, like someone was tampering with the car's power. Darren's heart began to pound in his chest as he quickly grabbed the door handle and tried to pull it open. But the door wouldn't budge. It was locked, and the door felt like it was holding him in place, as if it didn't want him to leave. The rattling intensified. The air inside the car grew colder, despite the engine running, and a low, guttural hum filled the silence. Darren's breath came faster now, and a cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He had to get out. He couldn't stay in here. He reached for the door handle again, but before he could turn it, the back seat seemed to shift. Something, or someone, was there, just out of view. Darren's throat tightened, his hands trembling. His eyes darted between the rearview mirror, the door, the seats, searching for any sign of movement. And then it came. Whispers, soft at first, but growing louder, rising up from the back seat. Low voices, unintelligible, like 100 murmurs coming from the very fabric of the car itself. The sound was maddening, like the car was alive, and it was trying to tell him something he couldn't understand. The whispers grew in urgency, and with each passing second the pressure inside the car increased. Darren could feel his chest tightening. his breath becoming shallow, as if the air was being sucked out of him. Panicked now, he slammed his shoulder against the door, trying to force it open. The car's interior felt smaller, tighter, as though the walls were closing in on him, and the whispers were all around him now, surrounding him, suffocating him. And then, in the rearview mirror, he saw it. A figure standing just outside the car. It was barely visible, just a shadow against the blackness of the night. Its face was obscured, but Darren could feel its presence, watching him, waiting. His heart raced as the figure slowly moved closer to the car, its steps silent on the road. The rattling continued, louder now, vibrating through the car like it was alive with dark energy. Darren tried one last time to open the door, but it was no use. He was trapped. The figure stopped just outside the driver's side window, pressing its face against the glass. Darren's breath caught in his throat. There was no face, just darkness, a deep void staring back at him. And then, the engine cut off. The car was silent now, its interior a cold tomb. Darren's breath came in panicked gasps, his mind spiraling into terror. He slammed the door again, but it was still locked, the whispers still rising, clawing at his sanity. In that moment, Darren understood. This car wasn't just a vehicle. It was a prison, a trap, a place that had claimed others before him and would claim him too if he didn't find a way out. But it was too late. The whispers were no longer just in his head. They were inside the car, swirling around him, pulling him towards something darker, something that had been waiting for him since he first stepped inside. The last thing Darren heard before the darkness consumed him was the softest whisper of all. "You're mine now." Story number 7. Night on the Overpass. Joe had driven these roads for years, the lonely stretches of asphalt between towns that never seemed to change. The hum of his rig's engine was familiar, like an old companion, and the solitude of the night was something he had learned to embrace. It was just him, the truck, and the endless highway stretching out before him. But tonight was different. The overpass came into view just ahead, its dark silhouette barely visible against the night sky. Joe shifted gears, the truck's engine giving a small lurch. He had driven through this overpass dozens of times, but something felt off tonight. He couldn't put his finger on it. Maybe it was the way the wind had picked up, how the temperature had dropped suddenly, or how the moon hung low and heavy, casting long shadows that made the world seem too quiet. He had just crossed the overpass when the engine sputtered. At first, he thought it was just a hiccup, something minor, but then the truck jerked to a stop, its engine roaring in protest before it died completely. "Not now," Joe muttered to himself, frustration creeping in as he tried to restart the rig, but the engine wouldn't turn over. He glanced at the dashboard. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out. He was stuck, completely stuck. The only thing he could hear now was the wind howling across the empty expanse and the steady rhythm of his own breathing. Joe grabbed the flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out of the cab, pulling his jacket tighter against the chill. The overpass was deserted, stretching out in both directions like a dark tunnel. No cars, no lights, nothing. The air felt heavy, thick with something he couldn't explain. His breath hung in the air, sharp and cold, as he walked to the front of the truck, hoping to figure out what was wrong. But as he passed under the steel beams of the overpass, he froze. Figures. Shadows moved just beyond the edge of his light, their forms barely discernible in the darkness. At first, Joe thought it was just his eyes playing tricks on him, the weariness of the road catching up with him. But the figures didn't disappear. They were standing still, watching him. Joe's heart pounded in his chest, his breath quickening as he swung the flashlight toward them. There were two of them now. No, three, standing just beyond the edge of the overpass, their shapes shifting in the shadows, their eyes gleaming in the dim light. But it wasn't just their eyes that unnerved him. It was the way they moved, or didn't move. They were still, frozen in place, yet their presence filled the air, thick and suffocating. "Who's there?" Joe called out, his voice tight with fear. His grip on the flashlight trembled. The figures didn't answer. Instead, they slowly began to move, their feet dragging along the pavement in a way that didn't seem quite right. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like they were part of the shadows themselves, shifting and bending in ways no living thing should. Joe's stomach twisted with unease. Something was wrong. Very wrong. The wind picked up, howling through the beams of the overpass, and the trucker's eyes darted back to his rig. He had to get out of here. He didn't know what those things were, but he knew one thing for sure. He didn't want to find out. He turned quickly, heading back to the truck, but as he reached the cab, the radio crackled to life. It wasn't the usual static. It was a voice, distant at first, then growing louder. "Joe." The voice was distorted, echoing through the speakers in a way that made his skin crawl. The radio crackled again. "Joe, you can't leave." Joe froze. The voice wasn't human. He could feel it in his bones, a presence that reached out from the speakers, filling the space around him. It wasn't just the radio. The whole overpass, the air itself, seemed to vibrate with something. An energy, a pull, something he couldn't escape. He grabbed the radio's dial, trying to turn it off, but the static only grew louder. The voice wasn't just on the radio anymore. It was all around him. "Joe, you're already here." He whipped around, shining the flashlight into the darkness. The figures were closer now, their movements slow and deliberate. Their eyes, those dark, gleaming eyes, were locked onto him. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he stumbled backward toward the cab. The truck felt miles away, the distance between him and safety growing with each second. He had to get out. He had to leave before it was too late. But the figures were closing in, moving faster now, their footsteps scraping across the road. They didn't run, didn't make a sound. Yet the weight of their presence pressed down on him like a crushing force. It was as though they were drawing him in, pulling him toward them, toward the unknown. And then he understood. The overpass. It wasn't just a place. It was something else. Something between worlds where the living and the dead mingled, where time had no meaning. The figures, the voices, they weren't from this world. They were spirits trapped in this space, just like him. He could feel it now, a cold, creeping dread spreading through him. He wasn't just stuck here because his truck had broken down. No, he had crossed into something darker. And the longer he stayed, the more the overpass would claim him, pull him deeper into its grasp until he became one of them. Desperation surged through him. He grabbed the door handle of the truck, wrenching it open, but the truck didn't start. The engine remained silent. The spirits were closing in, their shadows stretching across the asphalt, their eyes gleaming with an unspoken hunger. "Joe, you're one of us now." The voice crackled again, its tone mocking, final. "You can never leave." Joe's heartbeat thudded in his chest, and in that moment he understood. The overpass wasn't just a road, it was a threshold, a place where the living and the dead collided, and once you entered there was no turning back. The last thing he saw before the darkness overtook him were the figures, their faces twisted with empty smiles, waiting to claim him as their own. And then, nothing. Story number 8, The Last Rest Stop. David had been driving for hours, the hum of his rig the only sound accompanying him in the dead of night. The highway stretched out before him, empty and silent. a sea of asphalt lit only by his headlights. He was on his last leg of the trip, heading into the unknown, a long-haul driver used to the isolation of these overnight routes. But then, just past mile marker 163, he saw it. An old rest stop, a faded sign flickering in the dark. The glow from the gas station pumps was the only light for miles, casting a dim, orange haze. He was tired, his eyes heavy, and though he knew he should push on, his body was begging for a break. A quick rest, maybe a cup of coffee. He pulled into the lot, his truck grinding to a halt with a low rumble. The rest stop was rundown, the kind of place you'd expect to find in the middle of nowhere. Old, faded, as though it had been forgotten by time itself. The building looked like it hadn't been renovated in decades, its windows cracked and dirty, the neon lights above the entrance flickering weakly. David stepped out of the truck, his boots scraping against the gravel as he made his way toward the door. The night air was cold, a chill creeping into his bones. He pushed the door open, the bell above it ringing faintly, almost as if it were groaning with the weight of time. Inside, the place smelled stale, like dust and old coffee. The dim lights buzzed overhead, casting shadows in every corner. There was a counter up front with an older man behind it, his face worn and tired, but his eyes gleamed with something David couldn't place. Beside him, a vending machine hummed quietly, its lights flickering. David nodded at the man. "Hey, just a coffee and a quick stretch." The man smiled, though it was unsettling. Too wide, too perfect. "Sure thing, coffee's always ready." As David walked toward the vending machine, he noticed a few patrons in the room. They all sat in silence, their eyes locked on something invisible, their faces blank, almost too calm. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled. There was something off about them, about this place. He reached for the coffee, but when he tried to make his selection, the machine didn't respond. He pressed the button again, still nothing. The lights flickered again, casting the room into brief darkness. And when the lights returned, the machine had changed. The products inside were unfamiliar. Old brands, dusty wrappers. He thought he saw something move behind the glass. Something human. But when he leaned closer, there was nothing there. "Having trouble?" the man behind the counter asked, his voice smooth, too smooth. David shook his head. "Yeah, I guess." He made his way to the counter, his nerves jangling now. The coffee seemed to be the same as always, a dark, bitter brew, but the room had grown quieter, the patrons still staring off into nothingness. The air was thick, like something pressing down on him, suffocating the space. David paid for the coffee and turned to leave, but as his hand touched the door, he froze. The bell above the door didn't ring. It should have, but there was no sound at all. He pushed harder, but the door wouldn't budge. The light outside seemed further away than before, like the building had shifted. His heart started to race. He tried the door again, but it felt as though the rest stop itself had become a trap, its walls pressing in on him. "Something wrong, son?" the man behind the counter asked, his voice laced with an odd sweetness. David swallowed hard, his pulse quickening. I just need to go. The road calls." "Of course." The man smiled again, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. "But you won't be going anywhere, not yet." David's stomach dropped. He pulled on the door harder, but it wouldn't open. The silence in the rest stop was unbearable now, suffocating. The vending machine behind him clicked, the lights above buzzed, and the patrons all turned their eyes toward him, as though waking from a long, silent trance. Then it hit him. The realization that made his skin crawl. The faces of the patrons. They weren't just vacant, they were stuck. Their eyes didn't blink. Their mouths didn't move. It wasn't just a bad feeling. They weren't alive. They were frozen. And suddenly, the man behind the counter wasn't just a tired old man. His eyes were too wide, his smile too wide. His face had become something twisted, something grotesque. "Welcome to the last rest stop," he said, his voice now a low growl. The air around David thickened, and the world seemed to bend around him. The floor beneath his feet felt unreal, like it was swaying, as if he were standing on the edge of a void. The patrons slowly stood up, their movements stiff and jerky, their eyes locked on him. Their mouths began to open, whispering in a language he couldn't understand. But it didn't matter. He knew now. This wasn't a place meant for the living. The rest stop wasn't just a stop on a road. It was a trap, a liminal space between worlds, where time had no meaning, and the souls of those who had stopped here were forever trapped. They weren't waiting to get on the road again. They were waiting for someone else to join them, to replace them. David backed away, his heart pounding in his chest. The man's laugh echoed in the room, deep and hollow, as the walls of the rest stop closed in on him. The door behind him was gone. There was no escape. In the distance, beyond the flickering lights of the rest stop, he could see a road, a highway. He thought he saw a car pass by, but it was just another illusion, a promise of freedom that would never come. David understood, just as the others had. Once you stop here, you never leave. This place, the last rest stop, was the final stop for everyone. And now it was his turn. The walls of the rest stop shifted around him, the air thick with the whispers of the lost. And David, like so many before him, became another face in the crowd, trapped in the endless cycle of the last rest stop. Story number 9. A Road to Nowhere. Ethan had always considered himself a practical man. A truck driver by trade, he had spent countless nights on the road, weaving through cities and small towns, his headlights the only thing cutting through the darkness. But tonight, something felt off. He had been driving for hours, the steady hum of his truck filling the quiet air. The radio was nothing but static, and the GPS had stopped updating miles ago, an eerie glitch he didn't have time to fix. He had passed through a couple of small towns, but now the road stretched out before him in a long, winding line through a dense forest. It was late, well past midnight, and the only sounds were the occasional creak of his truck and the rustling of the wind through the trees. Then, the flashing lights ahead caught his attention. Red and blue. The kind of lights you see when there's an accident or some kind of roadblock. Ethan swore under his breath. He didn't want to sit in traffic in the middle of nowhere, not tonight. The last thing he needed was a delay. He glanced at his rearview mirror and spotted an unmarked road to the right, a narrow, unpaved detour that promised to take him around the wreck. Without hesitation, he turned the wheel, hoping to avoid the backup. The tires bounced over the uneven surface, the truck jerking with each bump. He barely noticed the lack of signs or the road's gradual narrowing. His only thought was to keep moving. Minutes passed, then 10 minutes, then 20. The road seemed endless, winding its way deeper into the forest. Ethan glanced at the trees, their branches twisted and dark against the night sky. They seemed to bend unnaturally, curving toward the road like skeletal arms reaching out to grab him. His grip tightened on the steering wheel. The further he went, the stranger it all seemed. "Just a shortcut," he muttered to himself. "Just a damn shortcut." The headlights bounced over the rough road, illuminating only a few feet ahead. As he passed a curve, something caught his eye, a road sign, but it didn't make sense. The sign read, "Next exit, 25 miles," but there was no exit, no sign of any kind of turnoff. The road just kept going, as if it was stretching into an infinite darkness. He slowed down, squinting at the sign. It had looked so real, the reflective surface catching his headlights just right. But as he looked, something inside him clicked. There was no town ahead, no landmarks, no other cars. The road had been swallowed by the forest, and the trees seemed to close in tighter as he drove further. He checked his rearview mirror again, half expecting to see the flashing lights from the accident behind him. But the road was empty. Not a single vehicle, no other headlights. The world around him felt too quiet. His skin prickled, and an unsettling feeling crept over him. He wasn't just on a detour anymore, he was somewhere else, somewhere that shouldn't exist. The road ahead twisted again, sharper now, and Ethan braked suddenly. In the distance, just barely visible through the thick shadows, there was something moving. It was hard to make out, but it looked like a figure, standing still in the middle of the road. He slammed on the horn, but the figure didn't budge. The headlights flickered for a moment, and when they returned to full strength, the figure was gone. Vanished, as if it had never been there at all. Ethan's heart raced as he gripped the wheel. He checked the GPS again. Nothing. No signal. He tried his phone, but there was no service. The familiar ping of his phone signal was absent, leaving him feeling even more isolated, more alone. The trees around him seemed to grow closer. The road narrowed again, and in the dim light of his headlights, the darkness ahead seemed to stretch deeper. The road signs continued to appear, each one more nonsensical than the last. Next exit, 5 miles. But he had already passed 5 exits, all of them disappearing the moment he reached them. His foot pressed harder on the gas, his mind racing. He needed to get out of this. He had to get back on the main road. But every time he thought he saw an end, it was swallowed by the dark, the path ahead leading nowhere. The trees began to change. They weren't just twisted anymore. They were grotesque, their shapes too exaggerated, as though they were alive and growing in response to his presence. The shadows between them grew darker, deeper. He could almost feel the weight of the night pressing down on him, as though something was waiting just beyond his vision. Then, the whispers began. At first, it was so faint that he thought it was the wind. But the longer he listened, the clearer it became. Low, unintelligible murmurs, like voices hidden just out of reach. He glanced around, his breath shallow. The voices seemed to be coming from the trees themselves, from the very air around him. "Keep going," the whisper seemed to say. "It's too late now." Panic surged through him. His foot slammed on the gas again, but the truck didn't respond. The engine sputtered, the headlights flickering wildly. The trees had turned into a wall of darkness, an impenetrable mass that seemed to surround him from all sides. Then, in the distance, he saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road again. This time, it didn't vanish. It was a man, pale, gaunt, his arms hanging limp by his sides. His face was twisted, eyes wide and unblinking, as though he had been waiting for Ethan. Ethan slammed the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt. He stared at the figure, heart hammering in his chest. But it wasn't the man that terrified him. It was the road behind him, the place he had come from. The forest seemed to close in, the path behind him now completely vanished, consumed by the same darkness that had swallowed the road ahead. He was trapped. There was no way out. The road he had taken was never meant to be traveled. And now, he understood. This was no detour. This was the end. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and the trees around him bent even further, their branches reaching toward the truck. They seemed to be pulling the world around him into something darker, something twisted. "Welcome," the man's voice finally came, clear as day. And with that, the last of reality slipped away. Ethan wasn't on a road anymore. He was somewhere else, somewhere far beyond the world he knew. The road to nowhere had swallowed him whole, and now there was no going back. Story number 10. The Phantom Car. It had been a long day for Peter. He'd been driving across the state trying to get to a meeting that felt less and less important the more miles he put between himself and the city. The sun had set hours ago, and now only the moon lit the empty rural road ahead of him, casting pale shadows across the tarmac. The occasional flicker of a streetlight was the only sign of civilization as the darkness swallowed everything else. Peter didn't mind the isolation. He was used to it. His job often took him along roads like this, desolate and quiet, where the only sound was the hum of the tires on the asphalt. But tonight, something felt different. Something wasn't right. He glanced at the rearview mirror. A car was following him. At first, he thought it was just another vehicle heading in the same direction. But after a few miles, the car hadn't passed him. It stayed behind him. A small, distant light in the mirror that was growing ever so slightly closer. Peter's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He sped up, pushing the pedal down, and the car behind him matched his speed. It didn't pass. It just stayed there, always at the same distance, never gaining on him, never falling back. The headlights were too bright now, blinding him in the mirror. The quiet stretch of road seemed to stretch endlessly in front of him, the car's headlights becoming an oppressive presence. He glanced at the speedometer. He was doing 80 miles an hour, but the car behind him kept pace. No matter what he did, it stayed there, locked to his rear bumper. A cold sweat broke out across Peter's back. He reached for his phone, but it had no signal. The isolation of the place had swallowed his connection to the world. He glanced around at the empty, dark fields surrounding him. No houses, no other cars. He was alone, save for the vehicle that seemed to be shadowing him. His mind raced. Was this some kind of joke? A prank? The thought didn't make sense, but the unease gnawing at him was real. He pushed the truck harder, the engine roaring beneath him. The road ahead was a blur, the only constant being the pair of headlights in the mirror. Peter's breath came faster. The car didn't belong here. It didn't belong on this road. The thought crept into his mind. What if it wasn't just a car? What if it was something else? Something waiting for him? He glanced back in the mirror again, and for a moment, the headlights flickered, and then nothing. The car was gone. For a second, Peter felt a rush of relief. He slowed down, letting the tension ease from his shoulders. Maybe it had been nothing. Maybe it was just his mind playing tricks on him after a long, exhausting drive. But before he could even convince himself, the headlights appeared again. This time much closer, filling his rearview mirror. The car was there, closer than ever, but it was different now. The headlights were so bright that Peter could barely see the road ahead. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. In a panic, Peter slammed his foot on the brake, trying to get the car behind him to pass. The phantom vehicle stayed in place, matching his every move, pulling in closer with every heartbeat. No matter how fast he went, no matter how much he tried to outrun it, the car stayed just behind him, relentless, following like it had nowhere else to be. He couldn't take it anymore. His pulse raced. His hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles ached. Peter slammed the brakes again and pulled hard to the side of the road, the gravel crunching beneath the tires. The car behind him did the same, screeching to a halt just a few feet behind. The headlights didn't dim. They blazed, searing into his eyes. The air around him felt thick, suffocating. With his heart pounding in his chest, Peter threw open the door and stepped out into the cold night. He had to see who was driving, who was chasing him down this empty road. But as he stepped away from the truck, the air seemed to change. The headlights didn't shift. There was no movement from the car. It sat there, still as death itself. its lights glowing like they were waiting for him to make the next move. Peter's breath came in ragged gasps, and he slowly moved toward the car, his feet heavy on the ground. The stillness was unbearable. As he walked closer, something strange washed over him. He couldn't see through the windows. The interior of the car was completely dark, like a void, an empty space that he couldn't quite grasp. And then, as if in slow motion, Peter reached the front of the car. He couldn't explain why, but he looked down at the road, the worn blacktop beneath his feet. And that's when he saw it. The faintest hint of tire tracks. The same tracks that had been left behind by his truck just minutes before. The tracks didn't make sense. They looped back on themselves. They formed a circle. A cold realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The car wasn't following him. The car was him. Or rather, it was his past, his memory. It was the same as the countless times he'd driven this road in the past, only different. The car wasn't chasing him. It had never left. It had always been here, waiting for him. A voice, low and haunting, whispered through the night. A voice that wasn't his own, a voice from the road itself. "You're next." Peter spun around, his heart hammering in his chest, but when he turned back, the car was gone. The headlights vanished into the dark. He was alone again. Or was he? The road stretched on, empty and silent. Peter took one step back toward his truck, his mind a whirl of confusion and fear. The sound of the engine roared to life on its own, the truck beginning to move forward without him. He didn't even have to look in the mirror to know the car was behind him again. It would never stop chasing him. It was the memory of someone who had died on this road long ago, a memory that would never let him leave. And he would never outrun it. Never.